On this edition, the cost of America's IOUs racked up over Afghanistan. In order to gain the backing it needed in its war against Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, the U.S. wooed many nations, some with conflicting interests in the region. Now that the Taliban has retreated from most of Afghanistan, what will happen to those vested interests? And who's owed what by the United States? Joe Schlesinger has traveled to Yale University, a center of U.S. foreign policy debate, to examine what could be a major dilemma facing the U.S. Joe?
Well, Ian, I'll be taking a look at all those promises the Americans have been making to various countries to get them to support the war against terrorism, and the question of whether the Americans will be able to, or even want to, keep them. On the campuses of America's most prestigious universities, the schools that turn out its leaders, they're suddenly immersed in a new debate over their country's global role. While most of the world is still preoccupied with the war, at Harvard, they're already busy looking beyond it.
Yes, how long can the United States be the policeman of the world?
Professors and grad students are debating the long-term effects of the short-term deals Washington has been making to sign up allies for the battle against terrorism.
It's time to let the American people in on the fact that there will be significant costs that we are going to have to pay as a result of the course that we have chosen to pursue.
At Yale, too, they're pondering the future, but they're looking at it with new eyes. Before September 11th, Yale was a fertile breeding ground of liberal causes and a center of protest against a whole array of U.S. government policies. Now, this forlorn peace sign, buffeted by the winds of change, is all that's left of the protest posters that once blossomed across the campus.
Speaking from my experience at Yale, I would say that that has changed 360 degrees. And now, if you are criticizing what the U.S. is doing abroad, intervening in a warlike situation, you're in the minority.
And that matters. It matters because Yaleys, as they call themselves, are not your average American college kids.
Why? Like, there's a lot of why. Why and what's going to happen in the future.
They're the crème de la crème, and they're very much aware of it.
We are, as Yaleys, important American servants. And
that may be the arrogance of youth speaking, but it's not an empty boast. Yale and other elite schools like it is where many of the ideas and people who run America come from. The last 3 presidents have all been Yaleys. Similarly, Harvard turned out 7 presidents. And these schools have also provided legions of the presidential advisors who've shaped U.S. foreign policy. Now, once again, as Washington has its hands full fighting a war and making deals here, there, and everywhere, here at Yale, at Harvard, and other such institutions, scholars are taking a look beyond the battle itself at how this war will change America, its relationships to the rest of the world, and how to get it right once it's all over.
Oh my God, there's this horrible problem, we have to go at it.
Strobe Talbot is a Yalie who's been there and come back. For 7 years, he was Bill Clinton's Deputy Secretary of State. Now, he heads Yale's think tank on globalization. Talbot sees danger ahead.
That danger is that we will now make unholy alliances, alliances of convenience, with anybody who professes to be on our side in the war against terrorism. Terrorism covers a multitude of sins and a multitude of phenomena. We have to be very careful what new friends we end up with.
And all of the things that were done from 1917 forward.
Over at Harvard, Stephen Walt, a professor of international affairs, sees another problem.
What we've really done is taken on quite an extraordinary array of foreign policy commitments, or to put it in slightly different terms, we have a very large agenda now. Doing any 1 or 2 of those would be a big job for any administration, and we've now taken on all of them, which makes me at least skeptical as to whether or not we're going to be able to pull them all off at any reasonable amount of time.
Those commitments are spread all over the map. To get at Afghanistan, the U.S. needed cooperation from its neighbors. To be able to operate in Central Asia, Washington also needed Russia's help. Not to make it all look as just a war against Islam, the Americans sought support from the Muslim world, not just from friends such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but also from regimes Washington until now had listed as terrorist, such as Iran and Syria. Secretary of State Colin Powell hopscotched the region, along with Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, shopping for support, from outright help to just getting fence-sitters to make the right diplomatic noises, and paid for it with a daisy chain of IOUs. They promised money, arms, food, and their political muscle to settle stubborn international problems. At the top of the list, war-ravaged Afghanistan. The Afghans are being promised a stable regime and help in rebuilding their country.
We certainly didn't help rebuild Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion and the American effort to help the Afghans throw the Soviets out. We then pretty much washed our hands of it. Hopefully we will have learned from that, but I wouldn't necessarily, bet the farm that we will.
The biggest immediate problem, how to get the winning Northern Alliance, the loose grouping of warlords from Afghanistan's various quarrelsome ethnic minorities, to share power with the dominant Pashtuns, who formed the mainstay of the Taliban. Trying to stitch together a government of moderates, as the United Nations is trying to do, in a country notoriously short on moderation will be a tough job. Getting Afghans to accept the rule of such a government will be even tougher.
Working out that formula is going to be vexing for the United States and for the Pakistanis.
For Pakistan and its president, General Pervez Musharraf, more than just vexing. The general's survival may depend on what happens next in Afghanistan.
If there's continuing instability and an escalation of instability, he will be swept aside in Pakistan, and you'll have what might be called the Afghanistanization or Talibanization of Pakistan itself.
Pakistan was the architect of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan 5 years ago. The Pakistanis inspired, armed, and financed the Taliban to assure themselves of a friendly regime on their western border while they confronted India, their arch-enemy to the east. Then the Americans came along in September and made Musharraf an offer he couldn't refuse. Abandon the Taliban, Colin Powell said, and we'll lift the punitive sanctions we've imposed on you for running a dictatorship and testing nuclear weapons, and we'll also bail out your ruined economy. For the Pakistanis, the American carrot was made all the sweeter by another consideration: their frustration at the stalemate in their decades-long conflict with India over Kashmir. They figured that helping the U.S. in Afghanistan would strengthen their hand in Kashmir. With both countries armed with nuclear weapons, any such tilt would create a dangerous situation.
Because of the zero-sum dynamic that operates between India and Pakistan, it will be a very hard balancing act for the United States, Britain, and everybody else in South Asia.
An even more difficult balancing act, responding to Arab expectations that their support for American military action, however lukewarm, be rewarded with U.S. pressure on the Israelis.
We've already seen them begin to take steps to try and reinvigorate the peace process. I think that's going to be an inevitable and unavoidable component of any serious effort to make global terrorism a less serious problem.
But what the Israelis are seeing as they continue to cope with terror attacks on them is that America's needs in its war on terrorism have tilted the process against them, and indeed calls for an end to Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories have escalated.
It's unworthy of Israel, and it's going to have to end at some point if Israel is ever going to be able to be truly secure.
But, says Stephen Walt, the U.S. must also revise its relationship with many Arab countries including Saudi Arabia.
The United States has basically adopted the view that the Arab and Islamic world is kind of a democracy-free zone. This, I think, is short-sighted. That over the long term, these societies are likely to liberalize and pluralize as well. And when they do, if we have been the principal prop of the old regime, we're going to get blamed. We're not going to find it easy to have good relations. So a little bit more of an even-handed or a little more distant relationship with some of these governments is probably in our long-term interest, even though it's going to cause some problems in the short term.